On the afternoon of Lunar New Year's Eve 2019, February 4th, 2019 by the Gregorian calendar, at Muang Thon Market, one of the oldest wholesale markets in Dien Bien Phu City, Dien Bien Province, Vietnam, the atmosphere became more bustling and crowded than usual due to Tet shopping activities by local residents. Among the modern kiosks and traditional stalls of ethnic minority people in Dien Bien was a small chicken stall run by Mrs. Tran Thi Hien's family. Helping Mrs. Hien was her daughter Cao Mai Duyen, born in 1997, a student at Thai Nguyen University of Agriculture and Forestry, who was home for the Lunar New Year holiday. Around 5:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve, February 4th, the market had become less crowded when a strange man approached the chicken stall, expressing interest in purchasing a large quantity for Tet and requesting home delivery. For convenient contact, this man asked for Duyen's phone number. Around 6 p.m. that same day, the unidentified man she had met at the market late in the afternoon called Duyen and asked her to deliver 13 chickens to the C13 market area in Thanh Truong Ward, Dien Bien Phu City, more than 2.5 miles from Muang Thon Market. 30 minutes later, around 6:30 p.m., Duyen rode her Honda Wave motorcycle with license plate 27 H1-740.07, carrying the chickens to the agreed location. When she left, she was wearing a white jacket and a blue helmet. More than 2 hours later, around 8:45 p.m. on February 4th, just a few hours before midnight on New Year's Eve, Duyen still hadn't returned home. Her family called her phone many times, but she didn't answer. Around 10 p.m. on February 4th, after waiting in vain for her daughter to return, Mrs. Hien, Duyen's mother, went to report to the police. According to information provided by Mrs. Hien, her second daughter Duyen had gone to deliver chickens more than 2 hours ago and was now missing. Upon receiving the information, the police sensed signs of danger and immediately mobilized a large force to search for the victim. The Dien Bien Phu City Police dispatched a task force from the Criminal Investigation Unit, along with police from the 3 wards of Muang Thon, Thanh Binh, and Thanh Truong, to trace the route from Duyen's family's chicken stall to the address of the man who ordered the delivery. Not only police, but neighborhood watch teams from the 3 wards, along with nearly 300 people, cooperated with Duyen's family to search boarding houses, more than 90 motels, hotels, warehouses, and abandoned houses, but found no trace of the young woman. The director of Dien Bien Provincial Police also directed traffic police forces along all routes to check whether Duyen had left the area on her motorcycle or whether anyone was riding her vehicle, but authorities found no leads. Because the area where the incident occurred bordered neighboring countries, Dien Bien Police even sought help from Lao Police to coordinate the search for the victim, suspecting Duyen had been tricked and sold across the border. From New Year's Eve night to the early morning of the first day of Tet, from the night of February 4th to the early morning of February 5th, the search and investigation in the 3 wards of Muang Thon, Thanh Binh, and Thanh Truong yielded no results, so authorities continued searching in the remaining wards of Dien Bien Phu City. Also on the first day of Tet, February 5th, Dien Bien Phu City Police screened 250 individuals under supervision, took photos for suspect identification, and sent them to Duyen's family for recognition. Afterward, police issued a notice to search for the missing person and items related to Duyen. More than 7,000 flyers were distributed to households throughout the communes of Dien Bien District and Dien Bien Phu City. On the morning of February 6th, residents discovered a motorcycle in a field in Team 18, Nung Luong Commune, Dien Bien District, Dien Bien Province, and suspected it belonged to Duyen, so they reported it to the police. Notably, this area was quite far from Muang Thon Market, where Duyen sold chickens, about 8.7 miles away, and about 11 miles from C13 Market, where Duyen had gone to deliver chickens before losing contact. The owner of the motorcycle was still nowhere to be found. Around 10 a.m. on February 7th, after hearing the cries for help from a woman named Bui Thi Kim Thu, residents rushed over and found Duyen's body in a pig pen of an abandoned house located right on National Highway 12 in Team 11, Dien Bien District, Dien Bien Province. This location was also very far from where Duyen's motorcycle had been found earlier, more than 12 miles away, and these 2 points were even in opposite directions. On February 8th, determining this to be an extremely serious case, Dien Bien Provincial Police reported to the leadership of the Ministry of Public Security and established a Special Investigation Task Force 0219D. About 150 criminal investigation officers in the province were mobilized. In addition, the Ministry of Public Security also directed the Criminal Police Department and the Professional Technical Department to send officers to reinforce and support Dien Bien Provincial Police in the investigation process. The task force established multiple teams to go to localities to encourage people to report crimes. In parallel with these activities, Dien Bien Provincial Police continued to screen thousands of suspects, especially those with criminal records for rape, murder, robbery, and extortion, checking whether anyone had conflicts or any relationship with the victim or the victim's family. In addition, investigating agencies worked with households living along Provincial Road 279 to extract images from security cameras, especially during the evening of New Year's Eve, the night of February 4th. After completing the autopsy procedures, the victim Duyan's body was returned to her family for burial. At the funeral, the victim's relatives were extremely heartbroken. Notably, the Dien Bien Provincial Police Investigation Agency reported that a strange man appeared at Duyan's funeral. Although his face always showed sadness, he kept looking around and showed suspicious behavior. When approached by detectives, this person claimed he was at the funeral to pick up loose change. In the days following Duyan's funeral, the victim's mother, Mrs. Hien, decided to live stream on social media to talk about the crime scene images where her daughter was kidnapped and murdered. Mrs. Hien also posted images mourning her daughter and received thousands of likes, shares, and followers from the online community. Mrs. Hien's very calm live streaming action was completely opposite to her previous state of collapse, making investigators feel there was something abnormal about this woman. Returning to data collection work, on February 8th, a task force from Than Truong Ward Police, Dien Bien Phu City, discovered a carrying rack, a chicken cage, and a white sack, suspected to belong to the victim when she went to deliver goods, discarded in an empty lot by the road in Group 11, Than Truong Ward, very close to where the man had arranged to meet Duyen at C13 Market to receive the chicken delivery. On February 10th, after screening security cameras on many routes, Dien Bien Criminal Police collected a valuable video at a store in the Ban Phu Market area, Team 16, Muang Nhe Commune, Dien Bien Province. This nearly 1-minute video captured the image of a man carrying 2 chicken cages entering the house of Mr. Vuong Van Ngia, a resident living in this area. Immediately, covert professional measures were deployed by Dien Bien Police. The person riding the motorcycle into Mr. Ngia's house was identified as his nephew, who called Mr. Ngia his uncle. It was Vuong Van Hung, born in 1984. This young man had a troubled past, was addicted to drugs, and had multiple criminal convictions. After the time of the crime, Vuong Hung had only been released from prison about 4 months earlier for illegal drug trafficking. Immediately, Vuong Hung was detained. Police also conducted a search of Mr. Ngia's house. The result was the recovery of many important pieces of evidence, including a motorcycle driven by Vuong Hung, an ATM card bearing the victim's name, a motorcycle registration paper in the name of Cao Van Huang, the victim's father, 8 live chickens, 5 that had been killed and butchered earlier, a chicken cage, and related evidence hidden in various places. It seemed the perpetrator had been caught, and the case would soon be closed. But after being arrested, Vuong Hung kept changing his testimony, making the task force suspect that this case was not so simple. Initially, Vuong Hung confessed that on the evening of February 4th, New Year's Eve, he had arranged to meet Duyen to deliver chickens in the C13 Market area, Than Truong Ward, Dien Bien Phu City. However, investigators determined that Vuong Hung's testimony did not match the evidence obtained, because if Vuong Hung had killed someone to rob property, why would he steal chickens but not sell them, steal the victim's motorcycle, but then abandon it far away? The initial forensic examination results also announced that the victim was believed to have died within 12 to 24 hours before the discovery of the body. If it was true that Vuong Hung had killed the victim on New Year's Eve night, Then from that time until the victim's body was discovered at 10 a.m. on February 7th would have been nearly 3 days or more than 60 hours. The timeline also didn't match. The case still had too many mysteries. While the investigation still had many complications, Mrs. Hien, the victim's mother, actively went on social media and asserted that the person just arrested was not the mastermind in the case. On February 10th, reviewing the circumstances, Dien Bien Criminal Police paid attention to a woman named Bui Thi Kim Thu. According to the chief of Than Nua Commune Police Dien Bien District, Thu was the first person to discover Du Yen's body and called people over, then reported to the police. Coincidentally, the house where the victim's body was discovered belonged to the family of Bui Thi Tom, Thu's sister-in-law. This house was unoccupied and had been abandoned for a long time. This abandoned house was only about 330 feet from Thu's house. According to police, after authorities arrived at the scene, both Thu and her husband were present there. Thu told those around her that she was the one who discovered the body. Her husband even commented very indignantly, "These people are barbarians. If caught, they should be executed by firing squad." Afterward, at their private home, Thu, her husband, and some neighbors continued to discuss Du Yen's body heatedly. At this point, detectives filtered out some additional information that Thu's husband was Kong, born in 1975, a notorious drug user in the area. Kong worked as a cargo transporter and owned a 1.25-ton truck with license plate 27 C03 4.75. The task force decided to quietly monitor Kong and Thu further. The detective force created a situation coordinating with traffic police to conduct an administrative check and issue a violation report to Kong. Afterward, authorities brought Kong to the police station to inspect the truck. Upon inspection, police discovered 2 dried bloodstains in quite hidden positions on the 1.25-ton truck bed with license plate 27C03 4.75 belonging to Congress, and quietly sent them for testing. Afterward, Kong returned home as normal. Kong even casually told neighbors that police had searched his truck but didn't know what it was for. While waiting for the test results on the blood sample from Kong's truck, police continued to monitor his actions and discovered that in the following days, several strange men frequently visited Kong's house. Through verification, they were Pham Van Neem, born in 1976, Luong Hung, born in 1991, Luong Van La, born in 1993, Pham Van Dung, born in 1972, and Cam Van Chuang, born in 1974. These were all drug users like Kong. In particular, La was the person who had been present at Du Yen's funeral to pick up loose change. On February 17th, test results showed the blood sample from Kong's truck bed matched the victim Du Yen's blood. Therefore, the investigating police agency had sufficient grounds to execute an arrest warrant for Kong's temporary detention. Also, on February 17th, Dien Bien Provincial Police also arrested the suspects, including Niem, Luong Hung, and La, because these people had come to Kong's house to use drugs on February 13th. Dung and Chuang did not participate, so they were not arrested yet. However, these 2 suspects were also within the detective's surveillance. The arrest of Niem, Luong Hung, and La was actually to investigate whether these suspects were involved in the case of victim Du Yen. After being arrested, initially all the suspects claimed they didn't know and were not involved in the case. In particular, Kong continuously pretended to have drug withdrawal symptoms, pretended to be deaf and mute, pretended to be sick to avoid giving testimony. Therefore, the task force decided to separate each suspect for further interrogation. Delving deeper into interrogating the main crime scene, surprisingly, Vuong Hung, the first suspect arrested in the case, gave new testimony that the location where Du Yen was murdered was at an abandoned house near an isolated hill, next to a ditch, not at C13 Market in Than Truong Ward, as he had previously confessed. The 3 suspects, La, Niem, and Luong Hung, also began to confess. These suspects also testified that after murdering Du Yen, some items related to the victim had been wrapped up and thrown into the ditch nearby. The task force immediately went to the scene to verify. Inside the abandoned house were many suspicious bloodstains along with some cigarette filter tips. At first glance, it seemed very suitable to be the main crime scene. However, the blood samples collected were not Du Yan's. Thus, at this point, the suspect's testimony still didn't match the traces at the scene, creating an increasingly larger question mark about the truth of the case. In parallel with the interrogation process, also on February 17th, the investigating agency suddenly made a decision to exhume the body. This met with much criticism because the majority of local people believed that authorities had conducted a cursory examination and now had to exhume again, affecting the soul of the deceased and reopening the family's pain. However, to ensure the confidentiality of the investigation work, at that time, Dien Bien Provincial Police did not make any statements before public outcry. Only later, when the case was clarified, did investigators and forensic experts explain that the police's purpose in exhuming the body was to clarify other circumstances, thereby finding the real clues of the case. The investigating agency raised many questions, including 3 major doubts. First, based on human survival principles, why, when kidnapped between life and death, did the victim seem to show no resistance? Evidence was that in the first examination, there seemed to be no clear traces. Police had to exhume the body to take biochemical samples, organ samples to find out whether the suspects had given the victim sleeping pills, poison, or used drugs. Second was to clarify whether the victim had been sexually assaulted by the suspects. This was one of the biggest questions that Dien Bien Provincial Police raised throughout the investigation process. Third, Vuong Hung confessed to using a steel wire to strangle Du Yin, but the traces at the scene in the first examination did not match, and when detectives went to look for the steel wire, as Hung testified, they couldn't find it. Therefore, they had to exhume the body to take samples for microscopic examination of neck injuries to verify Vuong Hung's testimony. But to be able to exhume the victim's body and re-examine it was truly not easy for authorities, not only because of public outcry, but also fierce opposition from the victim's family. Although before conducting the exhumation, the head of the Criminal Police Department and the chief of Dien Bien District Police went to meet the victim's mother, Mrs. Hien, to ask the family's permission, this woman did not agree. Even when the director of Dien Bien Provincial Police personally called, Mrs. Hien still did not allow the exhumation. However, with analysis from the family's lawyer, after many hours of persuasion, the victim's mother finally agreed and requested that a lawyer monitor from beginning to end. After re-examination, the 3 main doubts of the investigating agency were clarified. Examination of biochemical samples and organs found no sleeping pills, poison, or drugs in the victim's body. The investigating agency determined that the victim may have initially resisted, but later, due to being restrained, her health gradually weakened. The marks on the victim's neck were consistent with being strangled twice, but by a different object, not a steel wire as Vuong Hung had previously confessed. Notably, throughout the examination process, the task force saw Mrs. Hien, the victim's mother, continuously crying but then blurted out saying, "My child died with honor." This detail made investigators continuously feel there was something abnormal about the victim's mother and paid more attention to Mrs. Hien's actions. When the exhumation and re-examination work was completed, the investigating agency also clarified many more circumstances in the case and continued to interrogate the suspects. After determining that the tool used to strangle Du Yin was not a steel wire, as Vuong Hung had confessed, the suspects again changed their testimonies. Luong Hung confessed that it was Vuong Hung who used a 2-section nunchaku with metal chains. Kong still didn't confess anything and affirmed he was not involved. Police immediately searched for and recovered the 2-section nunchaku, sent it for testing, and received results showing Du Yin's DNA on the nunchaku. The investigating agency continued to require the suspects to clarify who fed the victim, because when the body was autopsied in the first examination, the results showed the victim's stomach contained much undigested food. After many interrogation sessions, the suspects Luong Hung, La, and Niem continued to confess that the whole group had sexually assaulted Du Yin after the kidnapping, and additionally confessed that 2 suspects, Deng and Chuang, also committed depraved acts against the victim. In particular, the suspects also testified that Thu, Kong's wife, knew everything, even fed rice to Du Yin and cleaned the victim. This shocked many people because previously, Thu was the person who discovered the body and called for help, while always showing indignation and sympathy for Duyan's death. Based on the suspect's testimonies as well as verified evidence, on March 20th, Thu was arrested. On March 22nd, police arrested Dung and Chuang after a period of surveillance. Thus, at this point, all 8 suspects involved in the case had been arrested. Immediately after being arrested, Thu always showed signs of mental illness. At the same time, Thu's relatives also submitted a request for psychiatric evaluation of this suspect. The Dien Bien Provincial Police Investigating Agency sent Thu for examination. It took nearly a month, which greatly affected the investigation process. However, the forensic psychiatric examination conclusion stated that Thu did not have mental illness and had full capacity for awareness and behavioral control. Although by this point the 8 suspects, including Vuong Hung, Kong, Nhiem, Luong Hung, La, Dung, Chuang, and Thu had been arrested, and some of them had confessed to criminal behavior, overall, the task force still hadn't determined who was truly the mastermind. A series of questions continued to be raised. What was the relationship between the 8 arrested suspects? Because it seemed Vuong Hung had only become acquainted with the other 7 suspects in the period just before the case, while Kong, Luong Hung, La, Nhiem, Dung, Chuang, and Thu all had close relationships or knew each other from before, frequently visiting each other and all using drugs, except Thu. If this speculation was correct, then there must be something very dark behind this case, and this was the concern of the task force. Why did this group only target Duyan? What was the relationship between these suspects and the victim? Because after all, Duyan was just a student, had no conflicts with the suspects, rarely lived in the area because she studied in another province. So why was Duyan kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and brutally murdered? To clarify the relationship between the suspects and the mystery behind this case, the task force used professional measures. On one hand, they informed Kong that Vuong Hung had confessed that Kong was the mastermind in the case. On the other hand, police also informed the opposite to Vuong Hung, that Kong had confessed that he was the mastermind. At this point, both suspects began to show concern. After many days of silence, Kong finally confessed that everything was masterminded by Vuong Hung. Conversely, Vuong Hung at this point also asserted that he had previously confessed because he wanted to protect the others in the group, because the suspects had sworn that if caught, they would not confess about the others. However, because Kong had betrayed his promise, Vuong Hung decided to confess that the ringleader was Kong. Thus, there was a contradiction between the suspects' testimonies. Investigators also informed the remaining suspects that Kong and Vuong Hung had confessed the whole truth, making these suspects equally panicked because they didn't know what Kong and Hung had confessed. Expanding the scope of investigation, Dien Bien Provincial Police wondered, since most of the arrested suspects used drugs, where did their drug supply come from and was there any connection from drugs leading to this case? Interrogating Luong Hung, because this suspect was worried thinking that Vuong Hung and Kong had confessed all criminal acts, when asked about the drug supply source for the suspects, Luong Hung quickly revealed important information that the kidnapping and murder of Duyan was closely related to a drug trafficking ring. According to Luong Hung, around 2009, he started going with Kong to deal drugs. Among them, Kong had dealt with a woman in Thanh Hung Commune, Dien Bien District. That was Mrs. Hien, Duyan's mother. The drug supply source for Kong's entire group was from a notorious drug lord in the underworld in Dien Bien. That person was V. Van Toan, born in 1982. During Tet 2019, Kong and his group of friends also frequently visited Toan's house. Some of Toan's neighbors also knew about this. However, during Tet, having guests visit was completely normal, so no one became suspicious. Suspect Chuang confessed that on the afternoon of the second day of Tet, February 6th, Chuang came to Toan's house to visit and saw Vuong Hung there. The reason Vuong Hung was there was because he and Toan had been prison mates, imprisoned together at a detention center in Son La. It was also here that Vuong Hung and Kong met for the first time when Kong came to Toan's house for Tet greetings. Based on the testimonies of Luong Hung and Chuang, as well as verification by the investigating agency from some households near Toan's house with security cameras, the relationship between the suspects had been somewhat clarified. Kong was forced to confess to knowing Vuong Hung at Tuan's house, and that Tuan was the one who hired Kong and Vuong Hung to kidnap Du Yen. With Kong's important testimony along with verified evidence, on March 28th, Tuan was arrested and identified as the mastermind of the case. From here, the knots gradually began to unravel. However, when first arrested, Tuan adamantly refused to confess, many times misleading the investigating agency. After a long process of interrogation using collected evidence and documents, finally the whole truth of the case was revealed. In May 2009, Tuan met Mrs. Hyen and sold her drugs for 300 million dong, approximately $12,500, but Mrs. Hyen didn't have money to pay. By June 2010, Tuan was arrested for illegal drug trafficking and went to serve his sentence, so the money Mrs. Hyen owed Tuan still hadn't been recovered. By 2017, Tuan was released from prison, but at that time, for unknown reasons, Tuan hadn't yet demanded the old debt of 300 million dong from Mrs. Hyen. About 2 years later, on January 31st, the 26th day of the lunar calendar at 9 a.m., Tuan went to Muangtan Market and encountered Mrs. Hyen, the victim's mother, selling chickens at the market. At this point, Tuan remembered to demand the 300 million dong for drugs that Mrs. Hyen had owed him for 15 years. But Mrs. Hyen said she had no money to pay because her buyer also hadn't paid her yet. Afterward, Mrs. Hyen left. On the morning of February 3rd, the 29th day of Tet, Vuong Hung came to Tuan's house to visit and met Kong there for the first time. Tuan said he wanted to collect the 300 million dong Mrs. Hyen owed. Then Kong also said that Mrs. Hyen also owed him 30 million dong, approximately $1,250 for drugs from 2017. Speaking of Mrs. Hyen, this woman had known Tuan and Kong for a long time through drug transactions. Normally, Mrs. Hyen frequently went to villages in Dien Bien to buy chickens to sell. According to some local sources, besides selling chickens, Mrs. Hyen also traded some other goods serving daily life to make profit. Mrs. Hyen's family was considered well off locally. It's possible that the chicken business was just a cover for Mrs. Hyen's drug purchasing activities. Due to the common goal of collecting money from Mrs. Hyen, Tuan and Kong discussed debt collection together. Tuan hired Vuong Hung and Kong to help collect the debt, promising to pay them with money and drugs. Kong suggested that if they kidnapped Mrs. Hyen to demand the debt, no one would pay ransom for her. They had to kidnap Mrs. Hyen's child to collect the debt. Tuan and Vuong Hung agreed with Kong's plan. Afterward, Kong returned home and recruited Luong Hung, La, and Nhiem to participate. On the afternoon of February 4th, New Year's Eve, Kong led Vuong Hung to Muangtan Market, pointed out Du Yen as Mrs. Hyen's daughter for Hung to know and get acquainted with, while also getting Du Yen's phone number. At 6:40 p.m. that same day, Vuong Hung called Du Yen to order 13 chickens. He asked Du Yen to bring the chickens to the C13 market area in Dien Bien Phu City. Afterward, Hung arranged a taxi from a friend's house to the meeting place with Du Yen. At the same time, Kong, Nhiem, Luong Hung, and La left Kong's private house in Kong's truck to kidnap Du Yen. According to the plan, while Du Yen was standing on the sidewalk with Vuong Hung taking chickens out of the cage, Kong approached from behind holding a 2-section nunchaku and quickly wrapped it around her head. Then, they all lifted Du Yen onto the truck bed and moved to Kong's house. As for Vuong Hung, he took all the property on Du Yen's person, including a motorcycle, 13 chickens, a phone, kept many personal documents and some other items belonging to the victim, with a total property value of 10,370,000 dong, approximately $430, then drove the motorcycle with Du Yen's chicken cage toward Dien Bien Phu City. At Kong's house, Du Yen regained consciousness. At this point, the young woman was very panicked and frightened, so she tried to escape. However, Kong, Luong Hung, and La discovered and captured Du Yen again, taking her to the bedroom. At the same time, Thu, Kong's wife, returned home and went to the bedroom, saw Du Yen tied up lying on the bed and asked, "Who's that?" Then was scolded by Kong. Thu said nothing and went outside. Right after that, Kong, Nhiem, La, and Luong Hung went into the bedroom, and successively sexually assaulted Du Yen. Afterward, Niem's friend Deng came to Kong's house to visit. Kong excitedly announced he had just caught a girl from downtown and suggested to Deng. Thus, in just one evening, Du Yen was sexually assaulted by 5 men. At 4 p.m. on February 6th, the couple Kong and Thu went to Toan's house for Tet greetings. However, when they arrived, Kong told Thu to wait outside in the car, then went alone into Toan's house and met Vuong Hung and Chuang. There, Kong asked Toan if he had called Mrs. Hien, and Toan said he had called but she had no money to pay. At this point, Kong told Toan that his group had sexually assaulted Du Yen and the victim was currently very weak. Although Toan criticized Kong's group for doing such a thing when kidnapping Du Yen was only to force Mrs. Hien to pay money, afterward Toan told Kong to go up with Vuong Hung that night to resolve it. Toan directed Vuong Hung to go to Kong's house first, and at this time Chuang also went along. Around 6 p.m. on February 6th, Kong intended to go into the bedroom to sexually assault Du Yen once more. Thu stood at the kitchen door looking up but had no objection, didn't go report it, even fed the victim and cleaned this young woman. Deng and Chuang returned home. In Kong's living room, at this time only Kong, Nim, La, Hung, and Luong Hung remained. Around 10:30 p.m. on February 6th, Toan came to Kong's house. The whole group sat talking to each other while Thu went down to the kitchen to get rice to spoon-feed Du Yen. Thu went to the living room and told Kong that Du Yen was very weak, could only eat a few bites. Kong said, "If she can't eat, then forget it. If her mother doesn't pay money, then kill her." Toan said that if they couldn't get ransom money, then they also couldn't let Du Yen return. They had to take her away to deal with. Niem said that if Du Yen was weak, then let her go to the hospital for emergency treatment. But Toan objected, because if they let Du Yen go for emergency treatment, it would be no different from turning themselves in. About an hour later, Kong drove the car to take the victim to the nearby abandoned house of Kong's younger sister in Team 11, Than Nua Commune. Afterward, the suspects returned to Kong's house and discussed how to evade guilt. Toan and Kong told everyone to celebrate Tet normally. If anyone was caught, that person would bear it themselves, not confess about the others. Kong also told his wife Thu to pretend to accidentally go up to the abandoned house and discover Du Yen's body, then report to neighbors and authorities to mislead the police investigation. After the truth was revealed, in addition to the criminal acts of suspects Toan, Kong, Vuong Hung, Luong Hung, La, Nhaim, Deng, Chuang, and Thu, the investigating agency determined that Mrs. Hien was directly related to the drug trafficking ring of the above suspects, which led to her daughter Du Yen being brutally murdered. The haunting phrase, "My child died with honor," that Mrs. Hien accidentally blurted out when authorities organized the re-examination of Du Yen's body was like a flickering light in the dark path of the case, helping the task force recognize abnormalities, thereby gradually delving into the relationship between Mrs. Hien and the suspects, opening one of the knots of the case. Therefore, on May 25th, Mrs. Hien was arrested for illegal drug trafficking. However, Mrs. Hien's conduct would be handled in a separate case. Afterward, the investigating agency continued to clarify many circumstances in Du Yen's case. From the establishment of the task force on February 8th, 2019 to October 9th, 2019, after nearly 9 months of investigation with extremely complex circumstances, the case of the chicken delivery student was officially closed. The DMBN Provincial Police Investigating Agency had completed the investigation conclusion for the case of murder, rape, and robbery, and the case was about to enter the next phase, which was the trial phase. On December 26, 2019, the first instance trial was held publicly. At the trial, some suspects suddenly recanted, not admitting to criminal acts. Among them, Kong and Vuong Hung both testified that they were coerced by investigators, subjected to torture so they were forced to confess earlier. However, after the suspects confronted the investigators, based on the case file as well as evidence and testimonies, the court determined that the above accusations by Kong and Hung had no basis. At the same time, they evaluated the defendants' actions as inhuman, condemned by the whole society. This was an extremely serious criminal act, tightly organized. On December 29, 2019, the first instance verdict sentenced the suspects Ton, Kong, Vuong Hung, Luong Hung, La, and Niem to death. In this case, although Tuan did not directly murder Du Yen, he was the mastermind who led other suspects to plan Du Yen's kidnapping. When the victim was weak and the suspects proposed to eliminate her, Tuan not only didn't prevent it, but also supported it, witnessed from beginning to end other suspects killing and disposing of the victim's body, while also discussing how to evade guilt. Therefore, Tuan receiving the highest sentence of death for the crime of murder was completely right person, right crime. Deng was sentenced to 15 years in prison for rape. Chuang was sentenced to 9 years in prison for rape. Thu was sentenced to 3 years in prison for failure to report a crime. The 9 defendants were ordered to compensate the victim's family a total of more than 200 million dong, approximately $8,300. After the first instance trial, defendants Kong, Niem, and Hung appealed the entire first instance verdict, continuously claiming innocence and not committing crimes as they had suddenly recanted at the first instance trial. Suspect Ton appealed for leniency, arguing that the death sentence was too severe. Mr. Cao Van Huang, the victim's father representing the victim, appealed the entire first instance verdict, assessing that the court had let criminals escape, had not clarified the defendant's criminal motives. He requested not to execute the 6 defendants to ensure humanity and to prevent the case from reaching a dead end. Therefore, on June 16, 2020, the High-Level People's Court opened the appellate trial. In addition to the appellants mentioned above, the 5 remaining defendants, Luong Hung, La, Thu, Deng, and Chuang, although they did not appeal, still had to appear in court because the victim's family had filed an appeal. On June 17, 2020, after more than 1 day of appeal review and deliberation, the High-Level People's Court in Hanoi rejected all appeals claiming innocence and requesting leniency from the 4 defendants, Kong, Vuong Van Hung, Nhiem, and Tuan, in the case of murdering Du Yen. The appellate court also reviewed the charges of the 5 non-appealing defendants, Thu, Luong Hung, La, Pham Van Dung, and Chuang, finding that the first instance verdict was right person, right crime. Regarding the issue of Du Yen's family appealing the entire first instance verdict and claiming that the court had let criminals escape, the court requested the victim's family to provide grounds. However, the victim's father, Mr. Cao Van Huang, only replied that it was based on his own speculation. Considering that any case must be based on documents and evidence to conclude and cannot rely on personal speculation, the trial panel rejected the victim's family's appeal, claiming the court let criminals escape. For these reasons, the appellate court upheld the first instance verdict. Before the first instance trial of Du Yen's case in late November 2019, the Dien Bien Provincial People's Court had also tried Du Yen's mother, Mrs. Hyen, along with accomplices Kong, Tuan, Luong Hung, and Vt Thu, Tuan's wife, for the crime of storing, transporting, illegally trading, or appropriating drugs. During the trial, Mrs. Hyen continuously wiped away tears and said she was wrongly accused, did not know the other defendants. However, based on evidence as well as testimonies of accomplices, Mrs. Hyen was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Afterward, Mrs. Hyen appealed because she believed she was wrongly accused. At the appellate trial in May 2022, the High Court found it necessary to clarify many issues that the first instance level had not resolved, such as contradictory testimonies of the defendants, results of investigative experiment examinations, and the exchange of money and drugs. Therefore, the court decided to partially annul the first instance verdict related to the charges and sentence for Mrs. Hyen. And as of the time this video was created, the supplementary investigation process regarding Mrs. Hyen's drug-related matters is still ongoing, and Mrs. Hyen remains in temporary detention. And that is the case for today. What are your thoughts on this case? Please share in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.